Thanks for coming all the way down here to my class.
The cookies you offered help.
Yeah, yeah, that would have been a good idea. So, yeah. I was given the topic of looking at of love. What does love mean? And it almost sounds trite to me, to talk about love, and because it's so misconstrued in our society. Everything is loving, or everything has to do with love. Happiness is love. This is love. I love you. Things like that. And so because of that, I want to come at it from a different direction. Because in 1 John, loving, to be like God who is loving, it's shown and manifested through giving His Son, right? And it's while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So that tells me something very peculiar about love. It seems to indicate that sometimes I've got to love the unlovable. I got to love and do kind things and look out for others when I may not really like them. It's what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, when someone strikes you on one cheek, you turn the other. That's not me. That's what I'm learning to be. But that's not my initial reaction. When I was growing up, I wasn't that way at all. So it took me a while to become loving. And I'm still being trained to love. So this has nothing to do about, I'm not talking about wives and husbands. I'm not talking about dating. I'm not talking about, male and female and things of that nature. What I want to talk about is something that is much more profound, and it has to do with our relationships with one another. And the only way that I know how to illustrate the depth is to make it very practical, to illustrate it in a congregational level, and then maybe we can comprehend just a fathom, a smidgen of the love of God. Because even John says God is love. Well, what does that mean? If God is love, that's just really too grandiose for me. I don't understand God in the first place. I can't comprehend a God like that. Now, I know some things about Him. I've come to trust in Jesus. I know God's the Creator. But when you talk about God, one of the things, the reasons I named our graduate school the Kearley Graduate School of Theology, it was intentional, because there's nothing greater than the study of God. That's what theology means. You cannot study anything more comprehensive, deeper, in magnitude than that of trying to study God. And so if God is showing us what love is, as John says here, just let's start out. 1 John chapter 4 is the text that I was given. And so I'm going to come around it sort of like what I did Sunday night. We're going to kind of come and then end with it. But I'm going to kind of begin with it here just to show you the difficulty. Because I don't want to be shallow. I don't want to be trite with it. I don't want to be cliche with this idea of love. So in order to avoid those things, I've got to come at a different direction so you won't tune me out and go in one area. We all know how to love, right? You hear it all the time, right? But the truth is we don't. You really don't. Not on the magnitude and the level that God loved and Jesus loved. So, verse 7 says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love." Now look at how many times the word love is mentioned there. What is the key element that affirms that we know the love of God and we're in the love of God? How did it start? Verse 7. How did it begin? What is the...
Love one another. Love one another.
Okay, there's another cliche. Love one another. Everybody talks about loving one another. Well, I can love you as long as you don't do me wrong. I can love you as long as you don't talk behind my back. I can love you as long as you didn't swindle any money from me. But it's when I've been hurt, cheated on, betrayed, stabbed in the back, lied to, that I choose to be loving instead of bitter, hateful, and those kinds of things. So the testing ground of love is where we live. So we really cannot experience God unless your love is tested. What's the difference between virtue and vice? How easy is it to have a vice? You don't have to do anything, right? I mean, vice comes naturally. I can commit all kinds of vices. I don't even have to train myself to commit a vice. It just happens. I can allow myself to commit vices. What about virtue, though? Natural? Just happens to be virtuous? I don't think so. I think virtue, the only way to grow in virtue is to engage it, employ it in the moment in which it's called for. For instance, you pray that God will give you patience. Okay, I pray that God will give me patience with my wife. I want to be patient with her. I want to show her love by my patience toward her. Well, she does something that makes me enraged or upset or whatever. And so right before I go ballistic, could be with her or a friend or whoever, okay? Before anything comes out of my mouth, I have to remember this is a testing ground that God has afforded me to employ patience. The same thing is true with her if she were to get upset with me. So the only time that virtue can be spurred along in that we grow in it is to employ it when it's called upon. That's the only way that I know to grow in virtue. So if I want to be a person who is a spendthrift, I want to save more than to spend, then when I have the impulse to purchase something that I really don't need, I just want it, then I have to employ constraint. I got to refrain from making that purchase, right? And in doing that, if I do that over and over again, then I begin to develop that habit of being a person who saves instead of spends. So that's the only way that I know to be virtuous. So the testing ground for love, folks, is the congregation. That is God's testing ground for you to grow in God's love. It's how we interact with one another, how we engage one another, how we treat one another. And there's one thing that I know, that when you bring people in, there's one truism that comes with people, where there's a collection of people: problems. That's the one truism. Because each one of us has different preferences. Each one of us has our different opinions. Each one of us has a different background. Each one of us frames arguments in a different way, thinks about solutions, following a different process. We're not alike. We are alike in some fundamental ways. We breathe. If we're born in Alabama, we're going to have some Alabamianism in us. If you're Arkansas, there's some cultural things about Arkansas, Jonesboro, whatever you are, you'll share a culture, but we're all different. And so when I go to websites and I see a page of a church, you know that the first impression is the most important. That's what we've always been told, right? Well, I've been in marketing, I've sold things, and I know that the first impression is very important. So when you go to a church website, of course they're going to put up the best impression they can. And so I go here and I see this church, and you have different ages, you have diversity, and everybody is what?
Happy.
They're happy, aren't they? I mean, there's unity. They're even excited about all being together. And that's the ideal. That's what we want to be. But I've been in ministry for over 30 years, and you have been in church for a long time, many of you. And one thing you know is that it's not always that way. I have never been to a church where there wasn't some kind of conflict. Some kind of conflict. Not every member knew about it. Sometimes the elders, they kept it close at hand because we were dealing with certain things. But there are relationship issues that occur in a congregation at different times. If it's not now, then one day it will be. So this lesson will be very important. If things are at peace and harmony and unity, and you have nothing that's going on, nothing that's percolating, nothing that's bubbling up, then okay, that's good. But there's going to be a time when that will change. You'll have another personality that places membership, or someone who's converted to Christ. A whole new person, a new variable is put into the kingdom, and it shifts and shuffles it, where now it's out of balance from what it was. Does that make sense? And so it's not always as clean as we imagine it to be. But therein is the opportunity that we have. When we have people in the kingdom, and when you have a collection of people in particular, you have people who come with their preferences. We all have our preferences. You have your shows, your books, your authors, your movies, your whatever that might be. You have your own particular preferences. Your preferences of how to dress, grooming preferences, friendship preferences. All of that is a part of the distinctiveness of what it means to be a human being. The problem is that if we are human by default, I know that sounds strange, but the default behavior of human beings is to put preferences above people. Because in our own minds, we vainly imagine that our preference is superior to others for whatever reason. We just do it naturally. It's natural to be that way. That's how cliques are formed. That's how various segmentation comes about, because of preferences being placed above people. Now, when you bring a collection of people into a congregation, they come in, they're in Christ, they're different. Do they shed everything in the beginning? Do you have a new Christian that's been forgiven of their past sins, okay, but does that remove their past habits, their past ways of looking at things, their past ways of framing things and how they perceive things? No, not necessarily. We would hope so, but that's not necessarily true. And I know it's not true because I see even in the early church those kind of things bubbling up and creating a lot of havoc. So understand that if we can come to appreciate that when you bring people together, there's automatically problems, that the church actually is a battleground of virtuous growth, of growing in love. If you can look at the congregation and your life in the kingdom as an opportunity of growth, then it's amazing to me how that changes you and changes everybody else. But we have to understand that when we come, we have people and preferences. Now, in the church in general, in the New Testament, several situations that you recall in early church history where you had problems between cultures, attitudes, ways of looking at things. And these are prominent. Acts chapter 6. You have the first seemingly division that's occurring in the church. Now, it didn't get to a full-fledged split, but it got close until something was done. On the day of Pentecost, you had Peter and the apostles who were preaching the gospel, right? It was the day of Pentecost. It was a Jewish holiday, and people came from all around the Greco-Roman Empire. Jews did. Jews who were Hellenistic Jews, that is, Greek-speaking Jews, Jews who had assimilated the Greek culture. And so when they descended on native Jerusalem, where the Jewish culture was prominent, can you imagine the kind of At first, everybody was excited, but it's kind of like when the honeymoon is over, you start to get a little bit irritated about certain things that people are doing, certain things that they're saying, or the way that they are saying it, or how they're thinking, or the assumptions they make about you. It begins to bubble up to the top. And so, in the daily administration of food that the early church had, there were some who were the outsiders that felt like their widows were being overlooked. Whether it was real or imagined, I don't know, but it was a problem because they felt that there was an intentional overlooking of their widows. And so it began to bubble up to the apostles, and the apostles said, well, look, choose you 7 men who meet these qualifications. We'll put them over that particular work, and we'll concentrate on preaching and prayer, right? So they chose 7 Greeks to put over the work to ensure that their widows were not being neglected, nor the native Jewish widows were not being neglected. Well, the early church was brilliant. The apostles were brilliant, being guided by the Spirit. Now, what if that action had not been taken? What do you suppose would have been the end result of the early church? It had been a split. There's no doubt about it. How would I know that? Well, I know that because of what I see today and in the past when churches have split over various things. We can argue about whether those were doctrinal, and some are, but it's been my experience that most of the challenges are preferences over people. Acts chapter 10. You have Cornelius, a God-fearer, who is very interested. He's praying. He's interested in the God that the Jews worship. And God sends to him and says, I've heard your prayer. Go and get Peter and bring him and he'll preach to you. So he sends a delegation down to Joppa where Peter is. It's on a rooftop. Before the delegation gets to Peter, God's got to condition him a little bit. See? He's got to condition him. So he gives him a dream of a sheet that comes down, has all kinds of animals in it. He tells Peter, arise, kill and eat. And Peter says, no, I can't do that. I can't eat any unclean thing. And then the voice says, what God has cleansed, it's not unclean anymore. And so that dream comes to him several times. And then there's the knocking on the door and the delegation arrives and Peter is told that he is to go to Cornelius' house. When he gets there, Cornelius, the God-fearer, he's not a Jew, he's just a God-fearer. He's embraced the Jewish faith. And so he has gathered his family, and Peter has come with his delegation, and they're all surprised. And when Peter sees the crowd, and Cornelius says, hey, I had this vision, and God told me to send for you all of this. Peter says, wow, I guess God is no what? Respecter of persons. And so he preaches the gospel to them. They become children of God. Now, if an apostle like Peter had to be somewhat conditioned to go and preach to this isn't a full-fledged Greek, kind of halfway there, he's a God-fearer, then it tells me that there is some conflict, there's problems with the cultures and how we think about one another. Acts chapter 50, we go say something? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and even later in Galatians, Peter goes back.
Oh, absolutely.
Paul has to call him out and say, what are you doing, man?
Yeah.
You're not eating with the Gentiles.
Absolutely.
They're part of the kingdom now.
Yeah, here's an apostle that gets rebuked by another apostle because he withdraws when certain men from James come. He was eating with the Gentiles, but he kind of backs away from them. So don't tell me this isn't real. This is really real. Now, in Acts chapter 15, the gospel has made its headway and people are becoming Christians, and now you're starting to have Jew and Gentile in the same church. In fact, that's why I think they were first called Christians, Acts chapter 11, because the church in Antioch was a combination of Jew and Gentile. Hey, this is Christianity in action. This is what it is. This is what it's leading to. And so you have some people from what's called the circumcision party that is having a difficulty in accepting the entrance of Gentiles into the church. And so there's this big meeting that happens, and they discuss the issue. And you have one side, you have the other side, and then it all comes together and they realize God is not a respecter of persons. We're not going to bind laws upon people that God has not bound. And so they encourage the Gentile Christians, they encourage the Jewish Christians, but in Acts 15 there had to be an assembly of the leaders in the church to discuss the issue. Now, you think about the church in Corinth. What do you know about the church in Corinth? It's the church that you go to learn what not to do because it's the church of divisions, right? What were they divided over? I mean, there's all kinds of things they were divided over. They were taking one another to court. The main thing was that of the division over spiritual gifts. Now, that's another thing that happened. Some had a particular gift, others had this gift, and one gift began to be elevated above others as if it was more superior than the other gifts that were miraculously given to certain individuals. Isn't it easy? Do you see how easy it is for human beings to vainly imagine some things about themselves in relationship to other people? The church is the testing ground of proving you're of God. It is God's way of giving us opportunity to grow in this God is love concept, this virtue of love. And so we're introduced in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10 and 11. There's divisions and quarrels among you. Chapter 3, jealousy, strife, and fleshly ambition. And these are Christians. They're not people who are outside of Christ where we would expect things like that. These are Christians. You're arrogant. You act like you're superior to one another. There's divisions. So there's obviously preferences over people. Have you already had a program before? Have you ever participated in a ministry, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Have you all ever done that? Where you kind of host a dinner and people come, but you don't know who's coming. That's kind of the fun in it. You don't know who's coming. So it's kind of stressful. And the idea is to get the congregation together. Otherwise, it's really easy to invite people over that you know. And you have some type of history with that you can engage in conversation. But what if you're an introvert? I'm really an introvert. I'm fine talking to crowds, but when I go individually, I can talk individually, but when I get to 3 or 4 or mingle, I'm not a good mingler. You know, so when I have a dinner party, my wife says we're having people over, my first impulse is, oh no, there's a dread that kind of comes down in me. But I enjoy it when it happens, but that's my natural impulse. So this program was very good. It was very good to stretch me. See, the church is a testing ground to grow in God's love. So let me tell you who's coming to church. You have people with preferences. I'm going to divide these up into 2 broad categories. I'm going to call it, now I'm not going to name you or anything. These are broad categories. Okay? One group of category is what I term as the will nots. Okay? The will nots. What are their characteristics? These are some of the people at our church. They're very reverent. Reverent individuals. Okay? Reverent in clothing and attitude, everything. They are individuals who are reminiscent. That is, they think, what was done in the past. Sometimes the glory days in the past. Today it's not. That's not any different sometimes from the Old Testament when the new foundation of the temple was laid. And you had those who saw Solomon's temple in the glory days and they were crying. And the newer generation who saw it were excited because now the temple was being restored. And you couldn't tell above the crying and the moaning, oh no, and then the excitement. Those who are in this broad category called will nots are often resistant to any changes or differences. Regimented. Everything's done decently and in order is a common characteristic. Key virtue, however, is responsibility. You have a will not, and you have them on your ministry or leading your ministry, they're the most responsible people in regard to ministry. You can count on them, they're loyal. They'll do the work, they'll commit to it. And so, to them, church is really an escape from everyday life. It's different. You come to an assembly. You're in God's kingdom. You're entering the, in denominational speak, the auditorium is a sanctuary. It's the idea that we're coming in to God's holiness. We're entering the church. So, shh. Show respect. Be quiet. You show your reverence attitude. And this has nothing to do necessarily with age. Because I'm more of this will not. Yes?
They're also the ones that hold the line.
Yes. Absolutely right. Loyal, committed. So you have the will nots. Now, I don't know if you're a will not. You might be. What I'm talking about is the broad categories, and we have some of both that I'm going to talk about here. We have another group that I call the why nots. You have the will nots and the why nots. What are some of the characteristics of the why nots? They're responsive. In other words, you have an idea and you put it out. The why nots, why not? They jump into it. They're responsive. You get often show great passion about something. They're the first to hit the ground running. The why nots, they want things that are relevant. I remember going through a phase in my preaching because I recognize the different people that I have in the congregation, so I want to make sure I'm feeding the flock. So I change up my preaching in order to engage all of the different facets of the congregation. And this group really responded to the how-to sermons. Like how to do this, how to overcome this, 3 steps, and you're better for it. So they like the 1, 2, 3 how-to. They sense a relevance about where they're living. They're relational. They stick together. Relationships are very important to this group. They're always together or looking to be together. They're more relaxed. It shows sometimes in their persona, their style, their dress. Their key virtue is receptivity. They're receptive to works. They're receptive to challenges. They're receptive. They just, But the problem is, sometimes in their receptivity, they don't think it through. And sometimes the will nots think on it too long. So you got those two different people. The church is a resource for everyday living. Everything's practical with the why not people. It's more practical. The will nots are more theological, more cerebral, more thinking, rational. There's more, it seems, emotional response from the why not people. Now, did you know that every congregation has these two groups of people? These are broad groups. Now, I won't take a hand showing as to which group you fall into, but I know that we have both groups represented here in this class, right? I just know it. So what do? Well, you start putting people over preferences. People over preferences. What does this mean when you put people over preferences? Well, it means that we start to look at the church being God's church, God's testing ground. To grow in the love of God, we're going to recognize that the will nots and the why nots need each other. The will nots and the why nots must respect each other. And we must empathize with each other. Neither group is right or wrong. You see, you can't say the will nots are right and the why nots are wrong, or the why nots are right and the will nots are wrong. That's framing it incorrectly. The way we frame it is to understand these are the people of God. So, my testing ground then is to kind of shift a little bit. Well, how do you shift? What do you do? Well, can you transform a will not, just a little bit, not asking much, can I transform the will not into a maybe? That's not going very far, is it? Is it possible that the will not, the one that's standing, that's here, committed, can say and hear and listen to the why not, and then say, instead of having the natural impulse to react in a negative way, or to demean, or to criticize, or to avoid, or to put out, could it be that we can say, well, maybe. Well, maybe. Go ahead.
I was going to say, well, I think a huge part of doing that, the way that you do that is obviously creating those relationships, covering who people are, because a lot of times you just see a projection of who people are from their actions or the ways that they react or act to certain things. But going back to walking in the light as He is in the light, part of walking in that light and uncovering who we are is doing away with the darkness that covers up aspects of who we are that we want to hide from people. And that includes just our history, whether it's good or bad.
We're good at labeling, aren't we?
Exactly.
And keeping people in a certain category. That's how we function. You know, we get everything organized and we got it in a pretty picture. And life isn't like that, actually. I think sometimes there's growth and there's movement, there's adaptability. And so maybe the will nots can become maybes, and why nots can become what? Maybe not. Now think about this though. This is profound philosophically, theologically. Because what does this recognize? What does this transformation, this little movement, recognize on the part of these broad groups? Well, no matter what you identify yourself with or whatever. Just from this, what does it recognize?
Caring for one another, loving each other.
Yeah. It's a willingness for my part to show the other respect and to listen, instead of formulating a decision based upon a false premise that may not be right on both groups about the other. So just a little step in regard to the testing ground of the congregation is illustrating the idea of God is love. How do we know that God is love? Well, He sent His Son to die while we were yet sinners. Okay, He took initiative. Nothing about us demanded that He do that. There is nothing good in us that God required God to do it. Even in Israel, He didn't choose Israel because of various things. He chose them because He loved them. Well, what does that mean? And if you look at Israel, did they disappoint God?
Many do.
I teach the Minor Prophets at Faulkner. And you've ever read the book of Hosea? Do you know that God is an emotional basket case in the book of Hosea? What do I mean by that? I don't know if you ever read it, because Hosea's life is used to illustrate God's love for Israel. And so God gets upset and he's about to destroy Israel. Then he backs up and says, I'm going to win her back. I'm going to be patient. You're going to be this. And he goes in this poetical language about the beauty of Israel, what she is. And then God gets angry again because of what Israel did. And then he says, no. It's just kind of up and down. You see God, and I think it's intentional to show that movement of forbearance, that love that He has. Now let me ask you this. Do you have that with one another? That forbearing spirit of love? Is it really possible? I think so. In 1 Corinthians 12:12, for even as the body is one and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit you were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. What did John record about Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17? That they may be one. And he even predicated it upon the basis that the world would believe in him if his people were what? One. So what does it mean to be one? Huh?
Moving in the same direction.
Moving in the same direction? I mean, oneness is profound. How can two who are so different be one?
You know, that's the same question about the Trinity. I mean,
Yeah.
we can't even explain how God and the Father, the Son, and Holy
And that's the
Spirit.
basis of 1 Corinthians 11 and 12 and 13. The problem, you know, the Trinity is used as the solidifying of the problem. If they understood God, they would not be divided over the spiritual gifts, because by one Lord this was given, by one God this was given, by one Spirit this was given. That's how Paul addressed it. If you knew God, you wouldn't be behaving this way. So why do we behave this way then? Well, it's because we come with our preferences. We're made complete in the same mind. I like how, this is the same verse that had all the ones, but I just pointed out some key elements. Christ, baptized into one body, drinking of the one Spirit. There are certain things that fuel us, that transform us, that puts us going in the same direction, walking as he walked. There is a danger. There's one group. That's the danger. You always have something that's going to threaten the unity of God's people. You have any idea what this group is called? The care-nots. They don't care. It's about them, their agenda, their preference, and they would rather split a church than to defer to a brother or a sister. Now let me tell you which is more mature. Is it more mature for me to defer? I mean, okay, I like the older songs. There's a large group that loves the newer songs. My wife, she doesn't like the screen when it just has words. She's in chorus, she grew up, she reads the music, and so it just gets all over her, and it doesn't bother me, you know. You know, when we have chapel, we have this words, and everybody knows the songs, but in our congregation we have the music, you know, sort of like what y'all have. So what do we do? I mean, this is just something little, but it becomes big when it's an irritant. It's like, you know, the way you squeeze the toothpaste over time. You know, these little annoyances begin to build and fester, and it causes problems. Isn't that really immature? Why can't I just defer? Do I really have to have it my way? Or is the loving thing to defer? And I realize this. In counseling, this is what you do, you know. Now, let me save you some money and go in counseling. If you'd have come to me, you know what I get to do? I began to prepare the seedbed for each one to defer to the other. That's what we're doing. Giving in. When the other gives, you know what happens to the other person? It kind of shifts. It's a different order of change. You have two people who are pulling on a tightrope, you know, pulling it, and I get one person to let go. Change the order of things. Throw a variable in it. You can't really fight, and the other person's not fighting. Or when the other person asks forgiveness, well, I'm not wrong. Defer. Learn how to defer. That's where the growth comes. Beware of the care-nots, though. This is what destroys congregations. So we got to be on the alert, stand firm, act like mature people, be strong. And notice this, let all that you do be done in love. I wonder why John, the apostle of love, talks so much about it. Do you know, I really believe that the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation are probably the most profound books in the New Testament. They're the simplest to read in Greek, except Revelation. But we always start, readers in Greek, the preachers, the Gospel of John. But when John uses light, and when John uses these simple words, you can't grasp them. It's kind of like God. You got to go all around it. It's big. And so that's why I think when you look at unity, it's really based upon what you decide to do as a member of God's kingdom. Will you be a conduit for bringing people together, peacemaker, I think is what Jesus called him? Or will you be one that kind of ruffles the feathers? Can you defer? Can you defer? That's really challenging because I've found myself oftentimes refusing to defer. And sometimes it hasn't been over anything doctrinal, but I've made it my doctrine. Because that's the way it ought to be. My way. Right? So remember that. When we deal with God as love, it's a lot deeper than what we give it credit. It sounds real simple in English, and you read through his books, but John, the testing ground is our relationship with one another. Let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Our Holy Father, we're grateful for the opportunity to be in here. Thank you so much for everyone who's present. Help us to learn these lessons of what it means to be loving. Help us to understand that each congregation has its own culture. Each individual has its own culture, and each family has its own culture. And we know that unless we make the intentional effort to defer, to put people above preferences, we'll always be struggling with love. Help us increase in faith, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you very much.